Hollywood legend Clint Eastwood walked off Jimmy Kimmel Live after a brutal on-air confrontation that left the audience stunned and social media exploding with outrage over the host's shocking disrespect. The studio lights dimmed as the familiar opening music of Jimmy Kimmel Live filled the air. What should have been a routine late-night interview celebrating one of Hollywood's most respected legends was about to become one of the most uncomfortable moments in television history. The audience, packed with eager fans hoping to catch a glimpse of the iconic Clint Eastwood, had no idea they were about to witness a train wreck that would dominate headlines for weeks. Eastwood emerged from backstage with his characteristic, measured gait, wearing a simple navy blazer and looking every bit the distinguished gentleman who had commanded respect in Hollywood for over 6 decades. The 94-year-old director and actor moved with surprising agility as he made his way to the guest chair, offering a reserved but genuine smile to the enthusiastic crowd. Their applause was thunderous, a testament to the enduring admiration for a man who had become synonymous with American cinema itself. Jimmy Kimmel bounded onto the stage with his usual theatrical energy, but there was something different in his demeanor tonight. Those who knew him well might have detected a subtle edge, a hint of the confrontational approach he'd been taking with certain guests lately. The host had been under increasing pressure from network executives about declining ratings, and whispers in Hollywood suggested he was becoming more aggressive in his interviewing style, perhaps compensating for what critics called his diminishing relevance in the late-night landscape. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the legendary Clint Eastwood," Kimmel announced with exaggerated enthusiasm, his arms spread wide as if presenting a prize on a game show. The audience erupted again, but Eastwood's response was characteristically understated. A simple nod and a brief wave that somehow conveyed more dignity than all of Kimmel's theatrical gestures combined. As they settled into their chairs, the contrast between the two men was striking. Eastwood sat with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove, his weathered hands folded calmly in his lap. Kimmel, meanwhile, seemed to vibrate with nervous energy, constantly adjusting his tie and shuffling through his note cards, with the manic intensity of someone desperately trying to control a situation that was already slipping away from him. "So, Clint," Kimmel began, his voice carrying a forced casualness that felt immediately off-putting, "you've been making movies for what, like 100 years now?" The comment was delivered with a smirk that he clearly thought was charming, but it landed with all the grace of a lead balloon. The audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing that what was intended as playful banter had crossed into territory that felt disrespectful. Eastwood's expression remained unchanged, but those who knew him could see the subtle tightening around his eyes. "Well, not quite that long, Jimmy," he replied with characteristic dryness, his voice carrying the gravelly authority that had made him one of cinema's most recognizable figures. "But I've been around long enough to know the difference between humor and bad manners." The comment hung in the air like smoke from a gunfight, and Kimmel's forced laugh couldn't dispel the tension that was already building. Instead of taking the hint and adjusting his approach, the host seemed to double down on his aggressive strategy. "Oh, come on, you can take a joke, right? I mean, you're practically indestructible. You're like the Terminator, except older." The audience's laughter was noticeably thinner this time, with many people looking around uncomfortably rather than enjoying what was supposed to be light entertainment. Eastwood's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady and controlled. "I've always believed that respect is something you earn, and something you give. Seems like that's becoming a lost art in some circles." Kimmel, either oblivious to the warning or deliberately ignoring it, pressed forward with what he apparently thought was comedic gold. "Speaking of lost arts, when was the last time you actually connected with audiences under, say, 70? I mean, your last few movies have been pretty much playing to empty theaters, haven't they?" The studio fell into an uncomfortable silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Even the crew members, usually focused on their technical duties, had stopped what they were doing to stare at the increasingly tense exchange. Eastwood's posture remained unchanged, but something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere of the room. "You know what, Jimmy?" Eastwood said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of controlled intensity that had made his screen presence so compelling for decades. "I've sat through a lot of interviews in my time, and I've dealt with all kinds of people. But I've never encountered someone who seemed so determined to embarrass both himself and his guest on national television." Kimmel's face flushed red, but instead of backing down, he seemed to interpret Eastwood's response as a challenge. The host leaned forward in his chair, his voice taking on a mocking tone that sent a chill through the studio audience. "Oh, I'm sorry. Did I hurt the feelings of the big tough cowboy? Maybe you're just not used to interviewers who don't kiss your ass and treat you like some kind of Hollywood royalty." The gasp from the audience was audible, and several people could be seen shaking their heads in disbelief. What had started as an uncomfortable interview was rapidly devolving into something far more serious. Eastwood sat perfectly still for a moment, as if processing what he had just heard, and when he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of someone who had reached the absolute limit of his patience. "Son," Eastwood said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, yet somehow carrying to every corner of the stunned studio, "I've been called a lot of things in my life. I've been threatened by studio executives, dismissed by critics, and challenged by directors half my age who thought they knew better. But never in all my years in this business has anyone been foolish enough to confuse my politeness for weakness." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Kimmel, perhaps finally realizing he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, attempted to backpedal with a nervous laugh that sounded more like a strangled cough. "Hey, come on, Clint. We're just having some fun here. This is comedy, you know? Entertainment?" But Eastwood wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, his steel-gray eyes fixed on Kimmel with the intensity of a man who had stared down countless adversaries both on screen and off. "Entertainment? Is that what you call disrespecting someone who's been working in this industry since before you were born? Is that your idea of comedy? Humiliating guests who come here in good faith?" The studio audience was completely silent. Now, caught between their reverence for the Hollywood legend and their discomfort at witnessing what felt like a public execution. Several people in the front rows looked genuinely distressed, as if they were watching their grandfather being insulted by a bully. Kimmel's face had gone from red to pale, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead under the hot studio lights. His handlers in the production booth were frantically gesturing, but he seemed frozen, unable to find a way out of the hole he had dug for himself. "Look, maybe I came on a little strong, but—" "A little strong?" Eastwood interrupted, his voice now carrying the full authority of his legendary screen presence. "Jimmy, let me tell you something about strength. Real strength doesn't come from tearing down people who've earned their place through decades of hard work. Real strength comes from lifting others up, showing respect, and understanding that with a platform like this comes responsibility." The camera operators, seasoned professionals who had seen countless celebrity meltdowns, found themselves mesmerized by the controlled fury emanating from the 94-year-old actor. This wasn't a tantrum or an emotional outburst. This was something far more powerful and unsettling. It was the quiet devastation of a man who had been pushed too far by someone who clearly didn't understand who he was dealing with. Kimmel made another desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. Okay, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Why don't we start over? Talk about your new project, maybe share some behind-the-scenes stories." "Behind the scenes?" Eastwood's voice carried a bitter edge now. "You want to know what goes on behind the scenes, Jimmy? Behind the scenes, there are hundreds of people who work their asses off to make shows like this possible. Camera operators, sound technicians, makeup artists, writers. People who understand that this business is built on mutual respect and professionalism. And then there are people like you, who seem to think that having a microphone gives you license to act like a spoiled child." The brutal assessment hung in the air like a judge's sentence. Members of the crew could be seen nodding almost imperceptibly, and it was clear that Eastwood's words were resonating with more than just the audience. Kimmel's own staff seemed to be watching their boss get systematically dismantled by a master of the craft. "Now wait just a minute," Kimmel finally found his voice, though it cracked slightly with indignation and desperation. "I've been doing this show for 20 years. I've interviewed everyone from presidents to rock stars, and nobody's ever—" "Nobody's ever what?" Eastwood cut him off with surgical precision. "Nobody's ever called you out for your behavior? Maybe that says more about the people around you than it does about me. Maybe it says that you've surrounded yourself with yes men who are too afraid or too invested in your success to tell you when you're acting like a fool." The accusation hit like a physical blow, and Kimmel's face contorted with a mixture of anger and humiliation. The host's famous quick wit, his ability to diffuse tension with a joke or a self-deprecating comment, seemed to have completely abandoned him. Instead, he lashed out with the desperation of a cornered animal. "You know what? Fine. Maybe I am direct. Maybe I don't kiss ass like everyone else in this town. But at least I'm not some washed-up relic clinging to past glory and pretending like the world still cares about cowboys and westerns." The words exploded out of Kimmel's mouth before he could stop them, and the moment they hit the air, everyone in the studio knew that something irreversible had just happened. The audience recoiled as if they'd been slapped, several people audibly, gasping at the sheer audacity and cruelty of the attack. Eastwood went completely still, his face becoming an unreadable mask that somehow managed to be more terrifying than any expression of rage could have been. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and deliberate, each one carefully chosen for maximum impact. "Washed up?" he repeated quietly, and somehow that whisper was more menacing than a shout could have been. "Let me tell you about washed up, Jimmy. Washed up is thinking that insulting your guests makes you edgy. Washed up is confusing cruelty with comedy. Washed up is a middle-aged man so desperate for relevance that he attacks people who've forgotten more about entertainment than he'll ever know." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the usually bustling production crew had stopped all movement, creating an eerie stillness that made every breath audible. Kimmel's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a deer caught in headlights, except the headlights belonged to an 18-wheeler bearing down at full speed. Eastwood rose slowly from his chair, his movements deliberate and controlled, like a gunfighter preparing for the final showdown. The audience watched in mesmerized horror as the Hollywood legend stood to his full height, his presence somehow filling the entire studio despite his lean frame. "You want to talk about past glory? I've got news for you, son. My past glory includes revolutionizing cinema, directing films that will be studied long after your little comedy show is a forgotten footnote. My past glory includes winning Academy Awards, creating characters that defined American culture, and earning the respect of generations of filmmakers." His voice grew stronger with each word, not louder, but carrying an authority that seemed to emanate from his very core. "But more than that, my past glory includes treating people with dignity, understanding that this business is about more than just ego and ratings. Something you clearly never learned." Kimmel finally found his voice, though it came out as a pathetic squeak. "Look, I think maybe we should just—" "No." The single word cut through Kimmel's attempt at de-escalation like a blade. "You don't get to decide when this is over. You started this, and you're going to hear what I have to say." Eastwood took a step closer to the host's desk, and Kimmel actually recoiled as if expecting a physical confrontation. "I've worked with the best directors in Hollywood, from Sergio Leone to Don Siegel to myself. I've shared scenes with legends like Lee Marvin, Gene Hackman, and Morgan Freeman. Do you know what all of those men had in common? They understood that greatness comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down." The camera captured every nuance of the exchange, from Eastwood's controlled fury to Kimmel's growing panic. The host's famous swagger had completely evaporated, replaced by the desperate fidgeting of a man who realized he had awakened something far more dangerous than he could handle. His hands shook slightly as he reached for his water glass, nearly knocking it over in his nervousness. "You sit behind this desk every night," Eastwood continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a closing argument. "Thinking you're some kind of cultural commentator, some voice of the people. But what you really are is a bully with a platform. You use your position to mock and belittle, and you hide behind the excuse of comedy when someone calls you out on it." The audience was completely transfixed, many people leaning forward in their seats as if watching the climax of a thriller. Several were filming with their phones, instinctively knowing they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. The tension in the room was so thick, it was almost suffocating. Kimmel made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation, his voice cracking with false bravado. "Hey, you know what? Maybe you're right. Maybe I was out of line. But this is live television, and sometimes things get heated. That's just the nature of the business, right?" The laugh that escaped from Eastwood was cold and utterly without humor. "The nature of the business? Jimmy, I've been in this business for over 60 years. I've worked with temperamental directors, egomaniacal producers, and method actors who thought they were the second coming. But I've never encountered anyone who used the nature of the business as an excuse for basic disrespect." He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering what felt like a final verdict. "You know what the real nature of this business is? It's about storytelling. It's about connecting with people, moving them, making them think and feel. It's about understanding that with great privilege comes great responsibility. And you, sir, have failed at every single one of those things tonight." The studio had become a tomb, with only the soft hum of equipment providing any sound. Kimmel looked like he wanted to crawl under his desk and disappear. His producer was making frantic, cutting motions from the booth, but nobody seemed willing or able to intervene in what had become a masterclass in professional destruction. "I came here tonight," Eastwood said, his voice now carrying a note of profound disappointment, "because I thought it would be a pleasant way to talk about my work, maybe share some stories with fans who've supported me over the years. Instead, I find myself having to explain basic human decency to someone who should have learned it decades ago." The weight of his disappointment seemed to crush whatever fight was left in Kimmel. The host slumped in his chair, looking smaller and more pathetic with each passing second. The confidence and cockiness that had defined his persona had been systematically stripped away, leaving behind a hollow shell of a man who had finally encountered someone he couldn't mock or dismiss. "So here's what's going to happen," Eastwood said, his tone shifting to one of absolute finality. "I'm going to walk off this stage, and you're going to sit there and think about what kind of man you want to be. Because right now, based on tonight's performance, that answer should terrify you." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Kimmel's face had gone completely white, his mouth moving soundlessly as if trying to form words that simply wouldn't come. The studio audience sat, in stunned silence, many with their hands covering their mouths in shock at what they had just witnessed. This wasn't just a celebrity walkout. This was a public execution of a man's character, delivered with surgical precision by one of Hollywood's most respected figures. Eastwood turned away from the host's desk with the fluid grace of a man who had made countless dramatic exits on screen, but this one carried a weight that no scripted moment could match. As he took his first step toward the stage exit, Kimmel finally found his voice, though it came out as a desperate, strangled plea. "Wait, Clint, please! We can fix this! We can edit it, start over, do whatever you want." The desperation in his voice was painful to hear, like a child begging not to be abandoned. "The network, they'll kill me if this airs. My career, my family, please, just give me another chance." Eastwood paused without turning around, his shoulders set with the rigid determination of a man who had made his decision and would not be swayed. When he spoke, His voice carried across the silent studio with crystal clarity. "Jimmy, the time for chances was when I walked out here tonight expecting to be treated with basic human dignity. You chose to throw that away for what you thought would be cheap laughs at my expense." The camera captured every detail of the moment. Eastwood's unwavering posture, Kimmel's crumbling facade, the shocked faces of audience members who realized they were witnessing television history being made. The host made one last pathetic attempt to salvage the situation, half rising from his chair with his hands outstretched in supplication. "But this is live TV. People make mistakes. Surely you understand that." His voice cracked on the last word, the false bravado finally giving way to genuine terror at what this moment would mean for his future. Eastwood finally turned back, but only halfway, giving Kimmel a profile view that somehow managed to be more intimidating than facing him directly. "Mistakes? Son, what happened here tonight wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. You chose to be disrespectful. You chose to be cruel. You chose to use your platform to try to humiliate someone who came here in good faith. Those aren't mistakes. That's character." With that final devastating assessment, Eastwood resumed his exit, each step deliberate and purposeful. The audience began to stir, some people actually standing up as if witnessing the departure of royalty. A few began to applaud, slowly at first, then building into thunderous appreciation for the man who had just delivered a masterclass in dignity under fire. But Kimmel wasn't finished. In a final act of desperation that would haunt him for the rest of his career, he shouted after the departing legend, his voice shrill and panicked, "Fine, walk away. That's what old actors do when they can't handle the heat. You're nothing but a washed-up cowboy living in the past." The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The audience's applause died instantly, replaced by audible gasps and boos. Several people could be seen shaking their heads in disgust, while others simply got up and walked out themselves, unable to stomach witnessing such a complete meltdown of professional conduct. Eastwood stopped dead in his tracks. For a moment that seemed to last an eternity, he stood perfectly still, and everyone in the studio held their breath. When he finally turned around one last time, his face carried an expression of such profound disappointment that it seemed to physically diminish Kimmel where he sat. "You know what, Jimmy?" Eastwood said, his voice now carrying a tone of almost parental disappointment. "I feel sorry for you. I really do. Because someday, when you're alone with your thoughts and your conscience, you'll remember this night. You'll remember that you had the chance to sit across from someone who's devoted his entire life to this craft. And instead of showing respect or curiosity or even basic decency, you chose cruelty. And that choice, that moment of who you really are when you think nobody's watching, that's going to stay with you forever." With that final devastating observation, Clint Eastwood walked off the Jimmy Kimmel live stage for the last time. The camera followed him until he disappeared behind the curtain, his departure marking not just the end of an interview, but the end of whatever respect Jimmy Kimmel might have commanded in Hollywood. The studio remained in stunned silence for several more seconds before Kimmel, looking like a broken man, finally managed to stammer out, We'll be right back after these messages." But his voice was barely audible, and his hands shook visibly as he shuffled his note cards. As the show cut to commercial, the damage was already spreading across social media like wildfire. Clips of the confrontation were being shared thousands of times per minute, with the overwhelming sentiment supporting Eastwood and condemning Kimmel's behavior. The hashtag #RespectClint began trending within hours, while the Kimmel meltdown painted a picture of a host who had finally pushed too far. By the next morning, the incident had become the lead story on entertainment news programs across the country. Industry insiders lined up to condemn Kimmel's conduct, with many longtime colleagues distancing themselves from behavior they described as unprofessional, disgraceful, and career suicide. The show's ratings plummeted in the following weeks as viewers abandoned a program they now associated with disrespect and cruelty. The confrontation had exposed something fundamental about the entertainment industry, that respect, dignity, and professionalism still mattered, and that audiences would not tolerate the systematic humiliation of beloved figures. Clint Eastwood had walked off that stage not just as a legendary actor, but as a symbol of integrity in an industry that had seemingly forgotten what that word meant. The incident became a cautionary tale studied in media ethics courses, and a reminder that in the age of social media, every moment of poor judgment can become a career-defining disaster. Jimmy Kimmel had learned in the most public and humiliating way possible that some lines should never be crossed, and that true legends like Clint Eastwood earn their status not just through talent, but through the quiet strength that comes from knowing exactly who they are and what they stand for.